Hi everyone, this is the third video for week 3, and again we're talking about nervous system cells. But for this video we are going to talk about the blood-brain barrier. So what is the blood-brain barrier? And you'll see in this video I'm going to basically shorten that up by saying BBB. So the blood-brain barrier is a mechanism that excludes most chemicals from the vertebrate brain. So we have our brain, and basically there's things that might be floating around in our blood that we don't want to be able to access our brain. And the reason is that our body does not regenerate brain cells the same way they might regenerate skin cells or other types of cells. So the body lines the brain's blood vessels with tightly packed cells. So when a virus invades our cell, the immune system is sort of alerted to attack and kill that cell. And again, that might be okay for skin cells, which are commonly reproduced in our body, but the brain does not replace damaged neurons in the same way that they might replace other cells in the body. So therefore, we have the BBB, the blood-brain barrier. So let's take a look at this picture. I like this picture because it just gives you a quick little breakdown that we've got our brain here, and then we've got the blood-brain barrier. So when blood vessels are close to the brain, for instance, in this diagram here, we've got red blood cells, and then we've got everything else that might be in our blood, large molecules, small molecules. So the blood-brain barrier is basically not allowing certain cells to come through and get to the brain. It might allow some certain small molecules, which we'll talk about in just a second. We're going to talk about the kind of molecules that are allowed to go through freely. But other molecules that we don't want to go through, it's basically preventing those from going through the blood-brain barrier. So let's talk about what the blood-brain barrier keeps out and what it might just more freely let in. It's keeping out most pathogens, bacteria and viruses, some drugs, and other harmful chemicals. But it's letting in certain small molecules that we know we need, for instance, oxygen molecules, CO2 molecules, and there's certain drugs, especially fat-soluble ones, that it is going to allow through freely. And there are even some viruses that can still get through the blood-brain barrier. Some examples are rabies, and chickenpox can enter our nervous system through the blood-brain barrier. And we have microglia, which we covered in our glial cells video. Microglia will fight off some of these viruses. And sometimes, for instance, in the case of chickenpox, it will ward off that virus, but the virus won't totally go away. And it might just sort of hide out in our nervous system. And that's why the chickenpox can reemerge as shingles later on, because it's sort of hiding out in that nervous system, but then can arise again as shingles when we get older. There are other things that our brain needs in order to function correctly. For example, glucose, that's our brain's primary energy source. And there are other things as well, amino acids, vitamins, etc., that the brain needs to be able to get through that blood-brain barrier. So there is a process that the blood-brain barrier has called active transport. It's a protein-mediated process that expends energy to pump chemicals that we need that can't just freely get over that blood-brain barrier. This process allows those things that we need to get over the barrier into our brain. So those things that we need that may need to use active transport, again, are glucose, which is a simple sugar. It needs to be able to cross that blood-brain barrier, and it's produced from carbohydrates. We also, as I mentioned earlier, need amino acids, and we also need oxygen, which again, that's a smaller molecule that can kind of just go through without that active transport process. And then thiamine, which is vitamin B1, is necessary for us to be able to use the glucose in our brain. So that's another example of a vitamin that we need for nourishment for our brain that has to be able to get through the blood-brain barrier. One interesting piece of information is that people who suffer from alcoholism may have chronic B1 deficiency, and that can lead to something called Korsakoff syndrome, which basically makes it much more difficult for people with that to be able to use that glucose in their brain, and it leads to some deficiencies in brain functioning. So this is another picture that I thought was pretty helpful of the blood-brain barrier. And it just sort of highlights that, okay, so we've got this blood vessel that might be close to the brain or nervous system somewhere. And we've got just our usual blood pumping through there, okay? And so what we've got here is a large molecule, for example, that isn't going to be able to just get through that blood-brain barrier freely. But then some examples of smaller molecules that are able to get through more freely are O2 molecules, CO2 molecules. So those are smaller molecules that can kind of just more freely get through there. And then there's also some fat soluble molecules that might more easily just be able to get through. But then through that process of active transport, that's where we have to have that active transport to be able to get glucose and other vitamins and amino acids over to the brain that we need for nourishment. So again, there's some things that can kind of freely go through, but through the process of active transport, we need that process in order to get other things that we need for nourishment for our brain, such as glucose, over to our brain. So that's all that I wanted to cover regarding the blood-brain barrier. If you have any questions, of course, let me know. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you.